Herkese merhaba. Londra-İstanbul hattında piyasalara özel bir parantez açalım. Özellikle bu hafta Türkiye'de yaşanan gelişmelerin Londra'daki yansımalarını konuşarak devam edelim. Cripstone Stratejik Makro kurucusu, stratejist Mike Harris ile birlikteyiz. Mr. Harris, thanks for joining our program.
My pleasure.
First of all, the recent developments in the last 48 hours, how do you think these are being reflected in London?
Well, people are obviously quite concerned. Since the election, people have seen monetary policy recalibration, economic policy recalibration, geopolitical recalibration, and suddenly they're smacked in the face saying, oh, there's no domestic political recalibration, it's just gotten a lot worse. And it raises a lot of question marks, so people are a little bit concerned.
Do these developments resemble in any periods in Turkish history?
Well, in one sense, like the shock move in the currency, yes, we've seen that plenty of times before, but usually it was because of massive excess. I think in a weird sort of way, it didn't cause a panic in the markets, but remember the court case to close the AK Party. That was very similar in a sense, but people probably were a little too relaxed about that one. In this case, it's almost a definitive verdict. But on balance, this is a new environment because this is the first time that we're seeing the mainstream opposition being directly targeted. And people have to wonder, does that risk the democratic safety valve that Turkey has always had? And which has been one thing that has kept Turkey on a path despite all of this consolidation of power, is that everyone knew there was always the opportunity at the ballot box. This doesn't end the opportunity at the ballot box, but it does raise questions about what the future intention is. Because it's very clear, I think, to foreign investors that Mr. Erdogan has no intention of leaving.
So how much foreign capital has excited Turkey?
Well, you've seen there's been quite a bit, but I think one thing to keep in mind, a lot of people, because even the Minister Şimşek was communicating there will be real currency appreciation, that made it very easy for a lot of people to just have very short-term money in Turkey. And they thought it would last, and they got shocked, so money came out quickly. But now the big question is, will the disinflation program continue? Personally, I think absolutely it must, because you can't be risking two things at the same time, political uncertainty and economic uncertainty. And I also think this is a deflationary development because it's growth negative over the medium term. It's jobs negative because people's willingness to invest in fixed capital was already challenged, and it's going to be all the more challenged because of this uncertainty, I think almost definitively through the 2028 elections. So I think this is weirdly quite positive for fixed income. It's pretty negative for growth.
So what about central bank? Shall we forget about interest rate cuts?
Well, we have a little bit of time until April 17th, I think it is. But we shouldn't forget about them because what's driving inflation in Turkey? Some people immediately said, oh, the currency weakened a lot. It hasn't been as dramatic in the end. But even so, people assume that there's a lot of currency pass-through. I think that's a static historic view. It's been wages that have drove inflation, and almost everyone got a 25 to 30% wage hike in January, no more, with trailing inflation of 44%. So wages are deflationary. If we get a higher March or April print, if I was the central bank, I'd want to say, okay, let's see what April looks like. So I would probably wait. But I don't think it does anything more than delay by one cut, because any inflation we see is just a tax on consumers at this stage because they don't have spending power.
So you expect a pause. Did I get it correct?
Unless it's very clear the currencies come way back. I mean, between now and April 17th, we could see people being much more relaxed. But on balance, I would want, if I were the central bank, I'd say, let's see if there was any inflation pass through because of the currency until April, but it's just the one meeting.
Okay, and then they will continue cutting, you mean?
Well, I think disinflation's real because actually the wage policy is very disinflationary. And this also is disinflationary from a growth perspective. Jobs, the impact that this development will have on jobs is, I think, meaningfully significant because it will reduce the propensity to invest. So ironically, Mr. Erdogan's in worse shape to actually win an election in 2028 if the economy matters, assuming that an election matters.
Mm-hmm. So we'll wait and see. Can we say that foreign investors are now in a wait-and-see period as well?
I think they must be. I mean, my guess, though, is that the carry trade investors who had a shock right here, if they sense that the currency is stabilized and there are no massive outflows, or sustained outflows, then where's your risk? So I think the more aggressive ones will come back as soon as domestic investors come back. But on balance, yeah, they'll definitely be, especially in the equity world. They were already waiting and seeing because the growth outlook has been questionable. But in fixed income, I wouldn't be, the reason I said it's not impossible we could get a cut in April is we could actually see fixed income flows back into the market by April 17th.
Okay, a lot might happen during that period. So you say that the rating cut cycle didn't end,
Absolutely not.
but you say that the TL appreciation period is coming to an end?
Well, the real appreciation of the TL was mostly historic. Going forward, the central bank victory is showing to the market that actually the currency is not driving inflation. If the currency was driving inflation, then inflation inflation would have been much, much lower already. There's been a disconnect. It's wages. So I'm pretty convinced that they should want to be in a position where we can actually not have real currency appreciation and still hit our inflation objectives. But because of this volatility we just saw, my guess is they're going to try and stabilize it. So by definition, that means from the point of stabilization, probably for the next month or two after that, we almost have to have real currency appreciation because they need to prove a point.
Do you think that Turkish economic program risk being derailed?
No, I think it's more likely. Shorter term, it's more likely that they stick with it because it's all the what are the causes? This development we saw in the last 48 hours was a reflection, I think, of insecurity about being able to win an election. Simply. And so, what else has been a cause of the AK Party's reduced popularity was inflation. It would be weird if they gave up on trying to cut inflation. Medium term, though, this is really growth negative, and I think so. From that perspective, the economic program, if we think it also means remaining disciplined and not returning to populism, this probably increases the likelihood of a return to populism in 2026 or 27.
So we have time, you say.
Yeah, so that's why I think fixed income investors, shorter term, will probably re-engage in the market.
So can you give a figure in terms of how much foreign capital exited from Turkey in the last 48 hours?
Well, I haven't been watching it minute by minute, and it's been changing quite a lot. But on balance, I think actually the carry trade money, let's assume it left, because carry trade is literally day by day. There were, it's the bigger question is what happens with domestic capital, right? And if domestic capital re-engages in deposits and local fixed income, then we're fine. And it's a bit like the previous time when we had to introduce KKM. It was a domestic sentiment that matters most. International investors are not driving this market anymore. They probably drove the move yesterday, though.
Yeah. It's so interesting because in Turkey, they always wonder what the foreign investors are thinking about Turkey. But when we ask the foreign investors, they say that, domestic investors' point of view is more important. It's so interesting.
Well, historically, it was the foreign investors. But remember when the currency was in free fall before KKM, foreign investors were gone. It was all people thought it's oversold, but the floor only occurred when the domestic capital flight basically at that stage stopped. So I think ultimately, until you're in a situation where Turkey is widely investable, foreign investors are very, very engaged, which we're still a long way from it, especially in the equity world, then the likelihood is it'll be the domestic sentiment that'll remain the driver.
So what about the big picture? When you talk about Trump's election, Europe's, trying to open up relations with Turkey and a possible ceasefire in Ukraine. When you see the big picture in Turkey's region, for example, how do you put these events, the recent events, in this big picture?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is when you do something like this, you always wonder, what are Europe and the U.S. going to say? Well, the U.S. isn't going to say anything, right? Europe also needs Turkey more than ever because of its defense pacts. So I think on balance, the geopolitical environment has allowed this to happen. It could happen anyway. I'm not saying it wouldn't have, but allowed this to happen in a way that there's almost no risk of international backlash. You'll hear comments and whatnot, but there won't be any teeth associated with it. So this is much more about the domestic response, not about the international response.
Mr. Harris, you have been following Turkey since 93 or something?
93, yes.
Yeah, lots of years. So you know Turkey very well and you follow Turkey very well. So when you look at these developments, how do you see? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic?
Well, the reason I'm optimistic is because as long as there's a legitimate election in Turkey in 2028, I think one of the things that I think that's interesting is, one, why does this happen? Is Imamoglu the only person that could beat Mr. Erdogan? Absolutely not. Okay, I'm going to say something controversial here, but I think Ali Babacan could have won the last election. And my point is, if you look at the last three presidential elections, 48% went to against Erdogan in all three of them, no matter who the candidate was. There's almost 48% of the electorate that if you roll out of bed, you get the vote. Now you need the Kurdish vote as well, which is one of the reasons why this action with the PKK is happening, it seems, because they're trying to peel away some of that Kurdish vote from the opposition. But my simple point is, as long as the CHP plays this card well, because it actually gives them some leverage, as long as they have a candidate that can appeal to socially conservative Turks, then the election is totally in play no matter who the candidate is. It's the same thing in the US. You know, the Democrats need a candidate that can swing some soft Trump voters. The CHP needs to come up with a candidate that can swing some soft Erdogan supporters. It's just natural politics. The swing voter matters. And that's the reason why until Turkey is at the stage where, as long as elections still matter in Turkey, I think you ultimately need to be optimistic.
Do you expect new measures from the Şimşek team?
I don't think they're necessary at this stage. Where I worry is, can they basically help to support growth if private and sector investment isn't there? So the measures might need to be not populist, but stimulatory from an investment perspective. So that's something I would be recommending that they look at, thinking how can we drive jobs growth, because that's where we're most at risk on a 2-year view.
Okay. What kind of questions do you have from your friends, from foreign investors about Turkey in the last 48 hours?
Well, sort of. They all start with what just happened. But in one sense, it wasn't, the timing was the question. It wasn't the action that was the question, because it had been well telegraphed even before the last election. And a lot of people basically, I think you get this Turkish spring question, right? But I absolutely stress, Turkey has a democratic safety valve. The comparisons with the Arab Spring are not remotely possible, because there was no other way to change governments in those countries. But I think that's the starting point that people get, that people come with.
Okay, Mr. Harris, thanks for joining our program.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Evet, Londra-İstanbul hattında piyasaları konuştuk. Cripstone Stratejik Makro kurucusu Mike Harris'le birlikteydik. Sözü İstanbul'a bırakalım.